The morning sun painted the small airfield in golden light as Dr. Sarah Martinez checked her medical bag one last time. She had been working as a flight medic for 3 years, but today felt different somehow. The radio crackled with routine chatter between pilots and ground control, a familiar symphony that usually brought her comfort. Little did she know that in just a few hours, her world would turn completely upside down. Captain Jake Thompson, a veteran pilot with over 15 years of experience, was conducting his pre-flight inspection of the medical helicopter. The aircraft, a reliable Bell 429, had served their emergency medical service faithfully for countless rescue missions. Sarah watched him move around the machine with practiced efficiency, checking every bolt, wire, and rotor blade. His movements were confident and sure, the kind that came from years of experience in high-pressure situations. "Weather looks perfect today," Jake called out to Sarah as she approached the helicopter. "We should have clear skies for most of our shift." The forecast had indeed been favorable, with light winds and excellent visibility predicted throughout the day. Sarah nodded and climbed into her usual seat behind the pilot, settling in among the medical equipment that had become as familiar to her as her own reflection. Their first call came in around 10 in the morning. A construction worker had fallen from scaffolding at a job site about 40 miles away. It was the kind of routine emergency they handled several times a week. Jake fired up the engines, and within minutes they were airborne, flying over the patchwork of farmland and small towns that stretched out below them like a living map. The rescue went smoothly. The injured worker had a broken leg and some bruises, but nothing life-threatening. Sarah stabilized him quickly while Jake maintained communication with the hospital, providing updates on their estimated arrival time. The flight back was uneventful, with the patient conscious and in good spirits despite his pain. It seemed like just another successful mission in their long partnership. After delivering the patient to the hospital, they returned to base for lunch. The afternoon brought 2 more calls, both relatively minor emergencies that tested their skills but didn't push them to their limits. An elderly woman experiencing chest pains and a teenager who had been injured in a bicycle accident. Each mission was completed with professional efficiency, the kind of teamwork that had made them one of the most respected medical helicopter crews in the region. As the day wore on, Sarah noticed Jake seemed more relaxed than usual. He was joking with the ground crew and even humming quietly to himself between calls. She had worked with enough pilots to know that this kind of confidence usually came right before something went terribly wrong. It was an unspoken rule in their line of work that the universe had a twisted sense of humor when it came to emergency responders. The weather began to change as evening approached. What had started as a clear, calm day was slowly giving way to building clouds and increasing wind speeds. The meteorologist on the radio mentioned a storm system moving in from the west, but it wasn't expected to reach their area until well after their shift ended. Jake checked the weather reports twice, confirming they still had several hours of safe flying time ahead of them. Sarah was restocking her medical supplies when the call came in that would change everything. A serious car accident on a remote highway. Multiple vehicles involved, at least 3 people critically injured. The location was almost at the edge of their service area, a challenging flight even under perfect conditions. But the ground ambulances were at least an hour away, and every minute counted when dealing with trauma patients. Jake didn't hesitate. Within 5 minutes of receiving the call, they were airborne again, racing against time and the approaching weather. Sarah double-checked her equipment, mentally preparing for what could be a very difficult rescue mission. The accident site was in a mountainous area with limited landing options, the kind of terrain that demanded absolute precision from both pilot and medical crew. As they flew toward the accident scene, Sarah watched Jake's demeanor shift from relaxed confidence to focused intensity. His hands moved over the controls with increased purpose, and his communication with air traffic control became more clipped and professional. She had seen this transformation many times before, but tonight something felt different. The approaching storm cloud seemed darker and more threatening than the weather reports had suggested. 20 minutes into the flight, the first gust of wind hit them without warning. The helicopter lurched violently to one side, causing some of Sarah's medical equipment to shift and clatter against the cabin walls. Jake corrected quickly, his knuckles white as he gripped the controls tighter. "Just some turbulence," he called back to her, but Sarah could hear the strain in his voice. The second gust was stronger, And this time the helicopter didn't just lurch but actually dropped several feet before Jake could regain control. Sarah felt her stomach leap into her throat as the aircraft bucked and rolled like an angry bull. Through the windscreen, she could see the storm clouds racing toward them much faster than anyone had predicted, their dark mass swirling with dangerous energy. Jake's voice came over the intercom, tight with concentration. "We're going to try to outrun this storm to the accident site. Hold on tight back there." But even as he spoke, both of them knew they were flying straight into the teeth of something much more dangerous than a simple weather system. The wind was becoming chaotic, shifting direction and intensity without warning, turning their normally smooth flight into a wild roller coaster ride through increasingly hostile skies. Sarah gripped her seat as another violent gust sent them spinning sideways. Through the chaos, she could see Jake fighting the controls, his years of experience the only thing keeping them airborne. But she could also see something else in his movements, something that made her blood run cold. The smooth, confident pilot she had flown with hundreds of times was beginning to show signs of real fear, and in their line of work, that was never a good sign. The storm hit them with the fury of a living thing. One moment they were flying through turbulent but manageable air, and the next they were caught in a nightmare of spinning winds and driving rain. The helicopter shuddered and groaned as Jake fought to maintain control, his face a mask of concentration and growing concern. Sarah could hear him muttering under his breath, running through emergency procedures she hoped they wouldn't need. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the chaos around them in stark, terrifying detail. The wind was no longer just turbulent but actively malicious, grabbing their aircraft and tossing it around like a toy. Sarah watched her medical equipment sliding and crashing inside the cabin, expensive monitors and life-saving devices becoming dangerous projectiles in the violent motion of their flight. "We need to turn back," Sarah shouted over the roar of the storm and the helicopter's straining engines. But Jake shook his head grimly, pointing toward their destination. Through the rain-streaked windscreen, she could see the flashing lights of emergency vehicles gathered around the accident scene. People were dying down there, waiting for help that might never come if they turned around now. Jake's hands moved frantically over the controls, trying to compensate for the chaotic air currents that seemed to change direction every few seconds. The helicopter would rise suddenly, pressed upward by a powerful updraft, then plummet as the air beneath them disappeared entirely. Sarah felt her stomach lurch with each violent movement, but her concern wasn't for her own comfort. She was watching Jake carefully, and what she saw worried her deeply. Sweat was pouring down the pilot's face despite the cool air rushing through the cabin. His breathing had become rapid and shallow, and his movements, usually so smooth and controlled, were becoming jerky and uncertain. Sarah had seen enough medical emergencies to recognize the signs of someone approaching their breaking point, and Jake was getting dangerously close to that edge. Another massive gust sent them spinning completely around, the horizon disappearing in a blur of clouds and rain. For a terrifying moment, Sarah couldn't tell which way was up. The artificial horizon on the instrument panel spun wildly, and she could hear Jake cursing as he tried to regain their orientation. When they finally leveled out, they were flying in completely the wrong direction, and precious fuel was burning away with each passing minute. "Jake, talk to me," Sarah called out, trying to cut through the chaos with a calm, steady voice. "What's our situation?" But when she looked at the pilot's seat, her heart nearly stopped. Jake's face had gone pale and his left hand was pressed against his chest. Even through the noise and confusion of the storm, she could see he was in serious trouble. "Chest tight," Jake gasped, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Can't breathe right." Sarah's medical training kicked in immediately. The combination of extreme stress, physical exertion, and the altitude was creating a perfect storm inside Jake's body, just as deadly as the one raging outside their aircraft. She suspected he was having some kind of cardiac event, possibly a heart attack brought on by the intense pressure of fighting the storm. The helicopter lurched again, but this time Jake's response was delayed and weak. His grip on the controls was loosening, and Sarah could see their altitude dropping steadily. Through the chaos of rain and wind, she caught glimpses of the ground rushing up toward them. Trees and power lines flashed past the windows, much too close for comfort. They were descending whether Jake intended it or not. Sarah unbuckled herself and moved forward, fighting against the violent motion of the aircraft. She needed to get to Jake to assess his condition and somehow help him maintain control. But as she reached toward him, the worst possible thing happened. Jake's eyes rolled back and his body went limp against his harness. The experienced pilot who had been their lifeline through hundreds of dangerous missions had just lost consciousness, leaving them alone with a storm that was trying its best to kill them. The helicopter immediately began to spin out of control without Jake's steady hand on the controls. The collective dropped, sending them into a sickening dive toward the tree-covered hills below. Sarah could hear the engines screaming as the aircraft picked up speed, and she knew they had perhaps 30 seconds before impact. Her medical training had prepared her for many emergencies, but nothing had prepared her for this moment when she would have to choose between trying to save Jake or trying to save them both. She made her choice in a heartbeat. Leaving Jake unconscious in his seat, Sarah threw herself toward the pilot's controls. She had watched Jake fly hundreds of times, had listened to him explain the basics of helicopter operation during their long flights together. But watching and doing were entirely different things, especially when the aircraft was spinning toward the ground in the middle of a violent storm. Her hands found the collective and cyclic controls, the primary flight instruments that would determine whether they lived or died in the next few seconds. The helicopter was still spinning, still falling, and the ground was rushing up at them with terrifying speed. Sarah could see individual trees now, their branches reaching up like grasping fingers waiting to tear their aircraft apart. She pulled back on the collective, trying to remember everything Jake had ever told her about emergency procedures. The helicopter's descent slowed slightly, but they were still spinning wildly and she had no idea how to stop the rotation. The storm was still battering them from all sides, making every control input feel like a desperate guess rather than a calculated maneuver. Through the chaos, Sarah caught a glimpse of the accident scene they had been trying to reach. The emergency vehicles looked like tiny toys scattered around the highway, their flashing lights barely visible through the rain. She realized with grim certainty that the people waiting for their help would have to wait much longer, if help ever came at all. Right now, her only focus had to be keeping their own aircraft in the air long enough to find somewhere safe to land. But as she fought with the unfamiliar controls, Sarah began to understand just how impossible her situation really was. The helicopter wasn't just a machine you could drive like a car. It was a complex, delicate balance of forces that required years of training and experience to master. She was trying to perform brain surgery with a hammer, attempting to control something she barely understood while nature itself tried to tear them from the sky. Sarah's hands trembled on the controls as she fought to make sense of the bewildering array of instruments before her. The helicopter continued its sickening spin, and every instinct screamed at her to panic. But her medical training had taught her something valuable about crisis situations. Panic killed patients faster than any injury. She forced herself to take a deep breath and think clearly, even as the ground rushed up to meet them. "Focus, Sarah," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the roar of the storm and the helicopter's struggling engines. She remembered Jake's voice during one of their calmer flights explaining how the cyclic control worked. "Small movements," he had said. "The helicopter wants to fly. You just have to help it remember how." She made a tiny adjustment to the cyclic and miraculously, the spinning began to slow. Not much, but enough to give her hope that she might actually have some control over their fate. The collective was still the mystery, though. The control that managed their altitude and the power to the main rotor. Too much and they would climb too fast, possibly stalling the engine. Too little and they would fall like a stone. Jake stirred in his seat beside her, groaning softly. Sarah glanced over and saw his eyes flutter open, confusion and pain written across his face. "What? Where?" he mumbled, trying to focus on the instrument panel. The sight of his medical emergency had been terrifying, but having him conscious again, even partially, filled Sarah with renewed hope. "You had some kind of attack," Sarah called out, still wrestling with the controls. "Chest pains, then you passed out. I've got the stick, but I need your help." Even as she spoke, she realized how insane this situation was. A medic with no flight training was trying to land a helicopter in a storm, while her unconscious pilot slowly regained consciousness. If anyone had told her this story, she would have assumed it was fiction. Jake blinked several times, his vision clearing as he took in their desperate situation. The helicopter was still descending, though much more slowly than before, and Sarah's inexperienced hands were making the aircraft buck and sway unpredictably. Through the rain-streaked windscreen, he could see they were flying over rough terrain, with no obvious landing sites visible in any direction. Okay, Jake said, his voice weak but growing stronger. "You're doing good, Sarah, better than good. Most people would have crashed us by now." He reached toward the controls, but his hands were shaking badly, and Sarah could see he was still far from being able to take over. The stress and whatever medical episode he had suffered had left him weak and disoriented. "Tell me what to do," Sarah said, her voice steady, despite the chaos around them. "I can see some flat areas ahead, but I don't know how to get us down safely." The storm was still raging, but it seemed to be moving past them somewhat, the wind shifting from chaotic gusts to more predictable patterns. It was still dangerous, but perhaps manageable if they could just figure out how to land. Jake squinted at the instruments, trying to read the altimeter and airspeed indicator through his blurred vision. "We're at about 800 feet, he said. "Too high and too fast for a safe landing, but you've got us stable. That's the hard part." He pointed to a clearing visible through a gap in the trees. "See that field? It's rough, but it's our best shot." Sarah could see the area he meant, a patch of open ground that looked barely large enough for their helicopter. It was surrounded by tall trees and power lines with what appeared to be a small creek running along one edge. Landing there would require precision she simply didn't possess, but the alternative was running out of fuel and crashing wherever gravity decided to put them. "How do I get us down?" Sarah asked, adjusting their heading toward the clearing. The helicopter responded sluggishly to her inputs, but she was beginning to understand the rhythm of its movement. Every action had a delayed reaction, and overcorrecting was just as dangerous as not correcting at all. Jake guided her through the basics of approach and landing, his voice growing stronger as adrenaline helped clear his head. "Reduce power slowly with the collective. Think of it like letting air out of a balloon. Too fast and we drop like a rock. Too slow and we'll overshoot the field." Sarah followed his instructions, making tiny adjustments while her heart hammered against her ribs. The trees seemed to reach up toward them as they descended, their branches swaying in the storm wind like grasping hands. Sarah could see individual leaves now, and she realized just how close they were to disaster. One wrong move, one moment of lost concentration, and they would be scattered across the forest in pieces too small to identify. "Landing gear," Jake reminded her, pointing to a switch on the panel. Sarah found it and felt the helicopter shudder slightly as the skids extended below them. The ground was rushing up now, much faster than seemed safe, but Jake assured her they were still within acceptable parameters. She could see rocks and small bushes in the field, obstacles that could flip them over if they hit wrong. 20 feet from the ground, a powerful gust of wind caught them and pushed the helicopter sideways toward the trees. Sarah's inexperience showed as she overcorrected, sending them lurching back toward the center of the field but at a dangerous angle. "Easy, easy," Jake coached, his own hands hovering over the controls ready to take over if necessary, though Sarah could see he was still too weak to manage a full landing. 10 feet. 5 feet. The helicopter's skids touched the rough ground with a jarring impact that rattled every piece of equipment in the cabin. But they were down, more or less in one piece, though the aircraft was tilted at an alarming angle on the uneven terrain. Sarah sat frozen for a moment, hardly believing they had survived. Her hands were locked on the controls, and she realized she was afraid to let go, as if releasing them might somehow undo their miraculous landing. Jake reached over and began the shutdown procedure, his movements automatic despite his weakened condition. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with amazement and gratitude. "I don't know how, but you actually did it." The engines wound down, and suddenly the only sound was the rain pattering on the cabin roof and their own heavy breathing. But their relief was short-lived. As Sarah looked around the isolated clearing where they had landed, she realized their problems were far from over. They were stranded in rough terrain with the storm still raging around them. Jake needed medical attention, and somewhere out there people were still waiting for help that wasn't coming. The helicopter that had brought them down safely might not be able to get them back up again. The silence after the engine stopped was almost deafening. Sarah sat in the pilot's seat, her hands still gripping the controls while Jake slumped against his harness, breathing heavily. Rain drummed steadily on the helicopter's roof, and through the windscreen she could see the storm clouds still swirling overhead, though the worst of the wind seemed to have passed. "Jake, I need to check you over," Sarah said, her medical training taking priority now that they were safely on the ground. She moved to his side and began a quick assessment, checking his pulse and breathing while observing his skin color and responsiveness. His heartbeat was irregular and too fast, his skin was clammy with sweat, and he was clearly still in significant distress. "I'm okay," Jake protested weakly. But Sarah could see he was far from okay. The combination of stress, Physical exertion and whatever underlying condition had triggered his episode was still affecting him. She suspected he had suffered a minor heart attack or severe anxiety attack, either of which could become life-threatening without proper treatment. Sarah opened her medical bag and began treating Jake as best she could with the limited resources available. She gave him aspirin to help with potential heart issues and started him on oxygen from their portable tank. But she knew he needed to be in a hospital, not sitting in a crashed helicopter in the middle of nowhere during a storm. While she worked, Sarah tried to raise someone on the radio. Their communication equipment had survived the rough landing, but the storm was creating heavy static and interference. She could hear fragments of transmissions from other aircraft and ground control, but nobody seemed to be hearing her calls for help. They were effectively cut off from the outside world. "The accident victims," Jake said suddenly, his voice thick with guilt and frustration. "Those people are still waiting for us. They could be dying while we sit here." Sarah understood his anguish, but she also knew that launching back into the storm in their current condition would likely result in their own deaths and help nobody. She looked out at the helicopter, assessing its condition in the fading light. The aircraft was tilted at an awkward angle on the rough ground, and she could see some damage to the tail rotor from their hard landing. Even if Jake recovered enough to fly, they might not have a functioning aircraft to fly in. The reality of their situation was becoming clearer and more desperate with each passing minute. As night fell, the temperature began to drop significantly. The storm had brought cold air with it, and without the helicopter's heating system running, the cabin was becoming uncomfortably chilly. Sarah found some emergency blankets in their survival kit and wrapped Jake in them, while trying to keep him conscious and responsive. "Sarah," Jake said, his voice suddenly more alert than it had been since his collapse. "I need to teach you something, and I need to do it while I can still think clearly." She looked at him with concern, wondering if his condition was worsening. But his eyes were focused and determined in a way that reminded her of the confident pilot she had known for 3 years. "What do you mean?" she asked, though part of her already suspected what he was thinking. The idea was so crazy, so impossible that she didn't want to voice it herself. But Jake had always been practical about emergency situations, and this was certainly the most extreme emergency either of them had ever faced. "You flew this thing down," Jake said, gesturing weakly toward the controls. "You saved our lives when I couldn't, but more than that, you have a natural feel for it. I've been flying for 15 years, and I've never seen anyone pick up the basics as quickly as you did up there." His words filled Sarah with a mixture of pride and terror. She had managed their emergency landing through desperation and luck, not skill. "Jake, I'm a medic, not a pilot," she protested. "What happened up there was a one-time miracle. I can't actually fly this thing." But even as she spoke, she found herself looking at the controls with new eyes. The instruments that had seemed so mysterious and overwhelming now held a strange familiarity. She could remember the feel of the cyclic in her hands, the way the helicopter had responded to her touch. Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken, but Sarah could see through the trees that full darkness was falling. Soon they would be completely isolated until morning, assuming the weather improved enough for rescue aircraft to reach them. But morning felt like a lifetime away, and Jake's condition could deteriorate significantly in that time. "Listen to me," Jake said, his voice taking on the tone he used when training new crew members. "The people at that accident scene have been waiting for hours now. Ground ambulances might have reached them by now, but they might not have. And even if they did, those medics don't have your experience with trauma cases. People could die tonight because we couldn't complete our mission." Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. She had become a flight medic because she wanted to save lives, to be the person who arrived when all hope seemed lost. Now she was faced with the possibility that her own limitations might prevent her from fulfilling that calling when it mattered most. "What are you asking me to do?" she said quietly, though she already knew the answer. Jake was asking her to do something that violated every regulation, every safety protocol, every reasonable precaution in aviation. He was asking her to fly a helicopter with virtually no training, in marginal weather conditions, to attempt a rescue mission that experienced pilots might hesitate to undertake. "I'm asking you to trust yourself," Jake replied. "I'm asking you to remember that feeling when you had the controls up there. You weren't just fighting the machine, you were working with it. That's what good pilots do, and you did it instinctively." He paused, coughing slightly before continuing. I can talk you through the technical parts, but the real flying, the feel for it, that has to come from you. Sarah looked out at the clearing where they had landed, mentally measuring distances and obstacles. The helicopter would need room to take off, and the trees surrounding them left very little margin for error. If she misjudged the takeoff, they would likely crash into the forest before they gained enough altitude to clear the treetops. But if she didn't try, people might die who could have been saved. The radio crackled with a broken transmission, fragments of words cutting through the static. Sarah caught enough to understand that rescue operations for the accident victims had been suspended due to weather conditions. Ground ambulances had reached the scene, but the most seriously injured patients needed immediate helicopter transport to trauma centers. Transport that wasn't coming because every other medical helicopter in the region had been grounded by the storm. Jake saw the determination growing in Sarah's eyes and nodded slowly. "There's something else you should know," he said. "This helicopter, this specific aircraft, it's been my partner for 8 years. I know every sound it makes, every vibration, every little quirk. And right now, despite our rough landing, I think she's still airworthy. The damage looks worse than it is." Sarah spent the next hour learning to fly a helicopter by flashlight in a storm-damaged clearing. Jake, despite his weakened condition, proved to be an excellent instructor when someone's life depended on it. He walked her through every control, every instrument, every procedure she would need to get them airborne and safely to their destination. "The hardest part is takeoff," Jake explained, his voice growing stronger as his excitement about her progress increased. "You need to lift off straight up until you clear those trees, then transition to forward flight. No fancy maneuvers, just steady, controlled movement. Think of it like performing surgery, precise and deliberate." Sarah practiced the motions without starting the engines, getting a feel for how the controls moved and responded. Jake had her run through emergency procedures, radio calls, and navigation techniques. Most importantly, he taught her to trust the instruments when her instincts might lead her astray. In medical emergencies, she had learned to trust her training over her emotions. Flying would require the same discipline. "What about landing at the accident scene?" Sarah asked, studying the charts Jake had spread across their knees. The crash site was on a mountain highway with limited flat areas nearby. Even experienced pilots found it challenging to land medical helicopters in such terrain, especially at night and in marginal weather conditions. "There's a rest area about half a mile from the accident." Jake pointed to a spot on the map. "It's not ideal, but it's flat and wide enough for our aircraft. You'll have to land there and transport the patients by ground ambulance to reach you. It adds time, but it's much safer than trying to land on the highway itself." As they prepared for takeoff, Sarah felt her confidence growing alongside her fear. The controls that had seemed impossibly complex a few hours ago were beginning to make sense. She understood now how the helicopter balanced thrust and lift, how small inputs could have large effects, and how the aircraft wanted to fly if she just gave it the chance. "One more thing," Jake said as Sarah ran through her pre-flight checklist. "Don't try to be perfect. Perfect is the enemy of good enough, and good enough will save lives tonight. Trust your instincts, trust your training, and trust this machine. It's brought us home safe hundreds of times, and it will do it again tonight." Sarah started the engines, feeling the familiar vibration as the rotors began to turn. But now, instead of being a passenger along for the ride, she was in control. Every sound, every vibration, every response of the aircraft was her responsibility. The weight of that knowledge was both terrifying and exhilarating. She increased power slowly, just as Jake had taught her, feeling the helicopter grow light on its skids. The trees around their clearing seemed to lean in toward them, their branches swaying in the rotor wash. Sarah had to fight every instinct that told her this was impossible, that she was about to kill them both through her inexperience and overconfidence. "You've got this," Jake said calmly, his own hands ready to take over if necessary, but clearly confident in her ability. "Just like you did during the storm, trust yourself." Sarah pulled up on the collective, and the helicopter lifted smoothly into the night sky. The sensation was incredible, like being lifted by invisible hands into a world where normal rules no longer applied. Clearing the trees required every bit of concentration Sarah possessed. The helicopter wanted to drift sideways in the light wind, and she had to make constant small corrections to keep them climbing straight up. But Jake's instruction had been thorough, and her natural feel for the aircraft served her well. When they finally rose above the treetops, Sarah felt a surge of triumph that was immediately followed by the sobering realization that the hardest part was still ahead. The flight to the accident scene took 30 minutes. Through clearing but still turbulent air, Sarah found herself settling into the rhythm of flying, making adjustments almost instinctively as Jake had predicted she would. The helicopter responded to her touch like a living thing, and she began to understand why pilots talked about their aircraft as if they were partners rather than machines. There, Jake pointed through the windscreen as they approached their destination. I can see the emergency lights. Below them, the accident scene was lit up like a small city, with fire trucks, ambulances, and police cars surrounding the wreckage of what had been a multi-vehicle collision. Sarah could see people moving around the flashing lights. Emergency workers who had been waiting for medical helicopter support that they had probably given up expecting. Landing at the rest area proved to be easier than takeoff had been. The flat pavement gave Sarah a clear reference for height and attitude, and she was able to set the helicopter down with only a slight bounce. As the skids touched the ground, she felt a moment of pure elation. She had actually done it, flown a helicopter through a storm and safely to their destination. But there was no time to celebrate. Almost immediately, she could see ambulances racing toward their position, their emergency lights cutting through the darkness. The most seriously injured patients from the accident were being brought to them. People whose lives now depended on Sarah's ability to get them to the hospital quickly and safely. The first patient was a young woman with severe head injuries, unconscious and breathing with the assistance of a mechanical ventilator. Sarah's medical training took over as she worked to stabilize the patient for flight, checking IV lines and monitoring equipment while preparing for immediate takeoff. Every minute of delay increased the risk of permanent brain damage or death. The second patient was an elderly man with multiple trauma injuries, conscious but in severe pain and shock. Loading him into the helicopter required careful coordination with the ground crew to avoid further injury. Sarah could see in his eyes the desperate hope that comes with seeing a medical helicopter arrive when all seems lost. Jake, despite his own medical condition, proved invaluable in coordinating the patient loading and communication with the hospital. His experience showed as he efficiently managed the complex logistics of a nighttime medical evacuation, while Sarah focused on patient care and flight preparation. "Hospital is expecting us," Jake reported as Sarah completed her pre-takeoff checks. "2 trauma surgeons standing by and they've cleared their best operating rooms. If we can get these people there in the next 20 minutes, they both have excellent chances of full recovery." The weight of responsibility settled on Sarah's shoulders again, but this time it felt different. This time she was ready for it. The flight to the hospital was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. With 2 critical patients in the back of the helicopter, every decision she made carried life or death consequences. But something remarkable had happened during her crash course in flying. The terror and uncertainty she had felt earlier were replaced by a calm, focused determination that reminded her of her most challenging medical emergencies. Patient 1 showing signs of increased intracranial pressure, Sarah called out, monitoring the young woman with head injuries while simultaneously flying the helicopter. Jake, despite his own condition, was managing the second patient and coordinating with the hospital. Their teamwork, forged through 3 years of medical emergencies, adapted seamlessly to their new roles. The night sky had cleared considerably, with only scattered clouds remaining from the earlier storm. Sarah found herself appreciating the beauty of flying in a way she never had as a passenger. The city lights spread out below them like a carpet of stars, and the helicopter moved through the air with a grace and purpose that felt almost magical. She was beginning to understand why Jake had fallen in love with flying all those years ago. 2 minutes out, Jake announced, his voice stronger than it had been all day. The adrenaline of their emergency mission seemed to be giving him renewed energy, though Sarah knew he would need immediate medical attention once they reached the hospital. "Trauma team is assembled and ready. Landing pad is clear and lit." Sarah could see the hospital's helipad ahead, a circle of bright lights on the roof of the main building. It looked impossibly small from their altitude, but Jake assured her it was plenty of room for their helicopter. More importantly, she could see the trauma team waiting for them, doctors and nurses ready to take over the care of their patients the moment they touched down. The approach to the hospital helipad required precision flying that would have terrified Sarah just hours earlier. But now, with 2 successful landings behind her and growing confidence in her abilities, she felt capable of meeting the challenge. She reduced power gradually, maintaining perfect control as they descended toward the small landing area. surrounded by the busy hospital complex. Perfect approach, Jake said admiringly as Sarah brought them in for a textbook landing. I couldn't have done it better myself. The helicopter settled onto the helipad with barely a bump, and immediately the trauma team rushed forward to receive their patients. Sarah watched with professional satisfaction as the injured woman and elderly man were quickly transferred to gurneys and rushed toward the operating rooms where surgeons waited to save their lives. The patients disappeared into the hospital. Sarah finally allowed herself to relax. She had done it. Against all odds, with no formal training and in conditions that would challenge experienced pilots, she had successfully completed a medical rescue mission. The helicopter sat quietly on the helipad, its engines winding down while she tried to process everything that had happened. How do you feel? Jake asked, and Sarah was surprised to realize she felt amazing. Exhausted, certainly, and still somewhat shaky from the adrenaline, but also exhilarated in a way she had never experienced. Flying the helicopter had awakened something in her she didn't even know existed, a connection between machine and pilot that went beyond simple mechanical operation. The hospital staff wanted to examine Jake immediately, but he insisted on debriefing with Sarah first. They sat in the helicopter's cabin, reviewing the night's events and Jake's assessment of her flying performance. His evaluation was enthusiastic and encouraging, praising her natural feel for the aircraft and her ability to remain calm under extreme pressure. You know, Jake said as medical personnel finally convinced him to come inside for evaluation, there's something you should consider. The aviation world always needs good pilots, especially pilots who understand emergency medicine. What you did tonight wasn't just impressive, it was extraordinary. You might want to think about making this more than just a one-time emergency. Later that evening, after Jake had been treated and released with medication for what turned out to be a stress-induced cardiac episode, Sarah found herself standing on the hospital's observation deck, looking out at their helicopter, the aircraft that had nearly killed them, that had tested every limit of her courage and ability, now looked peaceful and familiar in the bright lights of the helipad. The two patients they had rescued were both in surgery, and early reports were optimistic. The young woman's brain swelling was under control, and the elderly man's internal injuries were less severe than initially feared. Both were expected to make full recoveries, largely because they had received rapid helicopter transport to the trauma center during the critical first hour after their injuries. Sarah thought about Jake's suggestion regarding pilot training. The idea seemed both crazy and perfectly logical at the same time. She had discovered an aptitude and passion for flying that she never knew existed, and the aviation medical community could certainly use pilots who understood emergency medicine from both sides of the equation. Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself researching helicopter pilot training programs and talking to other medical pilots about their career paths. The night of the storm had changed something fundamental in her understanding of what she was capable of achieving. She had always been confident in her medical skills, but flying had opened up a completely new dimension of professional possibility. 3 months later, Sarah began formal helicopter pilot training while continuing her work as a flight medic. Jake became her mentor and biggest supporter, sharing his years of experience and helping her develop the advanced skills needed for medical helicopter operations. The helicopter that had been their salvation during the storm became her primary training aircraft. 1 year after that terrifying night, Sarah completed her commercial helicopter pilot certification and became one of the few pilot medics in the region. She could now serve as both pilot and medical crew when needed, a combination that proved invaluable during complex emergencies and staffing shortages. The story of the night she had seized the controls during a medical emergency became legendary among emergency medical services personnel. But for Sarah, it wasn't about the dramatic rescue or the impossible odds she had overcome. It was about discovering that sometimes the most important moments in life come when chaos takes over, and you have to trust yourself to find a way through. That night, when the sky itself seemed determined to destroy them, she had found not just the courage to survive, but the passion that would define the rest of her career. Years later, as an experienced pilot medic, Sarah would often tell new flight crew members that flying wasn't about controlling the aircraft, but about partnering with it. The helicopter wanted to fly, she would explain, just as injured people wanted to heal. Sometimes the most important thing you could do was trust that partnership, and have the courage to seize the controls when chaos took over the sky.